Her eyes once commanded every room she entered. Today, they can barely find a single face in it. For 6 decades, that gaze ruled the British stage, powered a worldwide spy franchise, and carried an empire on screen. And for over 10 years, she kept working long after her own sight had started to fail, leaning on friends who read her lines again and again, while audiences never once suspected a thing. What really happened the year she walked away from her most famous role? How do you keep performing once your own eyes turn against you? And why, even now, will she not say the word retirement? To understand, you have to go back to where it all started. Judith Olivia Dench was born in York, England on the 9th of December, 1934. Today, at 91, she is regarded as one of the finest actresses Britain has ever produced, a career stretching over 6 decades across stage, film, and television. It didn't begin in front of cameras. It began on the boards of the Old Vic in 1957. The theater shaped her first, and Shakespeare shaped the theater around her. She became one of the defining Shakespearean performers of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Between 1976 and 1977, she stood beside a young Ian McKellen and played Lady Macbeth in a production still studied today. Cinema would come for her too. In 1998, she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for Shakespeare in Love. 3 years earlier, she had already become a fixture in one of the most recognizable franchises on Earth, stepping in as M in the James Bond films, a role she carried from GoldenEye in 1995 all the way to Skyfall in 2012. 7 Oscar nominations followed her across her career, more than a dozen BAFTAs, a Tony, and in 1988, she was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Recognition for a body of work built on something deceptively simple, a voice no one could mistake, a presence no stage could hold, and a gaze the whole world came to remember. That same gaze is the one now slipping into darkness. In 1957, a 22-year-old from York walked onto the stage of the Old Vic and didn't leave the theater world for the next 60 years. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. What she had was harder to name and impossible to ignore, a presence that made audiences lean forward, certain that whatever she was about to say mattered. The RSC noticed first. She moved through tragedy and comedy with a precision critics struggled to put into words. In 1976, she stood opposite Ian McKellen in a Macbeth so stark, so stripped of spectacle, that it's still taught in drama schools as proof that 2 actors and a bare stage can carry more weight than any set. That partnership would outlast marriages, careers, and decades, and would still be standing 50 years later, when both of them had far more to grieve than a fictional Scottish king. What rarely made the headlines was the life running alongside all of it. She married the actor Michael Williams, and together they had a daughter, Finty Williams, who built her own acting career. There was a grandson, Sam, born into a family that had now spent 2 generations on stage and screen. And in 2001, while Judi Dench was still one of the most in-demand actresses in the world, still playing M, still filling theaters, Michael Williams died of cancer. She didn't stop working. She didn't stop performing. But anyone who has lost a partner while the world kept demanding their face in front of cameras knows the particular, unglamorous endurance it takes to do both at once. By 2012, Judi Dench had spent 55 years building one of the most respected careers in the history of British performance, on stage, on screen, through grief, through triumph, through every version of herself the industry asked her to become. That same year, she said goodbye to M. What almost no one knew, watching her leave MI6 for the last time, was that something else had already begun, quietly, almost invisibly, inside her own eyes. The cameras kept rolling. The headlines called it the end of an era for Bond. Nobody yet asked what it might be the beginning of for her. In 2012, the same year she left M, Judi Dench received a diagnosis she wouldn't speak about publicly for years. She was 77. The condition, age-related macular degeneration. Doctors shorten it to 3 letters, but the consequences are too large to compress. It attacks the macula, the small area at the center of the retina responsible for the sharpest, most detailed part of human vision. The part that lets you read a sentence, recognize a face, follow a hand moving across a stage. In most cases, it doesn't cause total blindness. It does something crueler. It hollows out the center of sight while leaving the edges intact, so the world doesn't vanish. It blurs, smudges, and slips out of focus exactly where a person most needs it clear. There are 2 forms. one dry and slow, one wet and aggressive. It's among the leading causes of vision loss on Earth, and it rarely arrives all at once. It comes in stages. In small losses, a person can talk themselves out of noticing until one day they can't. For Judi Dench, that day didn't come quickly. It came slowly, across more than a decade, gathering speed in private while she continued in public to do the one thing everyone assumed required perfect sight: act. In November 2022, speaking with Louis Theroux, she finally let a small crack of honesty into the conversation. Asked how bad her vision had gotten, she didn't reach for drama. She offered something far more devastating in its plainness. Bad. Bad enough. You're just a tad fuzzy. It was the kind of understatement only a woman who had spent 60 years controlling exactly what an audience was allowed to feel could deliver. By 2023, the fuzziness she described had narrowed into something far more absolute. Speaking to the Daily Mirror, she put it in terms that left no room for interpretation. I can't see on a film set anymore, and I can't see to read, so I can't see much. Read that sentence again and sit with everything it's quietly asking you to understand. A film set wasn't a backdrop for Judi Dench. It was the place she'd spent more than half a century learning to command, where the precise angle of a glance, the smallest shift of an eyebrow, could carry an entire scene. To say she could no longer see one wasn't a complaint about inconvenience. It was an admission that the very terrain of her artistry had become unreadable to her. And reading, a script, a letter, a line of Shakespeare on a page, had been the foundation beneath every performance she'd ever given. An actress doesn't simply recite words. She absorbs them, turns them over, finds the breath and the silence inside them long before she steps in front of an audience. That process begins on a page. For Judi Dench, the page itself had started to disappear, and the cruelest part wasn't professional. It was personal. Every single day, in ways smaller and more constant than any premiere. Recognizing a friend across a room, finding a door handle without searching, trusting her own eyes to tell her the truth about the world right in front of her. By the mid-2020s, her sight had narrowed to little more than blurred shapes and color. The question was no longer whether her vision was fading, but what an actress does when the world she once commanded with a glance can no longer be seen at all. For most actors, the answer would simply be, you don't. But Judi Dench was not most actors, and she did not stop, not in 2012, and not for nearly a decade after. What she did instead was quietly, almost defiantly, rebuild the entire mechanics of her craft around a disability she'd told almost no one about. The foundation of that rebuilding was something she'd carried since childhood, long before any diagnosis: a photographic memory. For most of her career, it had simply been a tool among many. After 2012, it became the whole structure holding her work upright. She could no longer read a script the way every actor before her always had, so she found another way. Friends began reading her lines aloud, over and over, until the words settled into memory the way water settles into stone. I've had to find another way of learning lines, she explained, which is having great friends repeat them to me over and over and over again. It wasn't glamorous. It was closer to brute endurance, dressed up afterward as effortless talent. On set, she had to know precisely where a line sat on the page, not to read it, but to anchor herself in space, to know when to turn, when to pause, when a partner's silence meant it was her turn. For short scenes, the system held. For longer parts, she admitted, it grew far harder to sustain. But even the most extraordinary memory has its limits, and by 2022, those limits had arrived. Her last major scripted screen appearance came that year in Spirited, where she appeared as herself rather than carrying a full dramatic role. Since then, no major scripted project. The method that had carried her for a decade, friends, repetition, memory standing in for sight, had finally reached the edge of what it could compensate for. What followed wasn't a press release, no formal announcement, no farewell tour, no statement from a publicist marking the end of an era. Instead, the truth arrived the way most hard truths arrive in a life as private as hers had always insisted on remaining. Quietly, almost by accident, in the middle of an ordinary conversation between two old friends. In November 2025, the truth finally arrived on camera, almost by accident. ITV News brought Judi Dench together with Ian McKellen to mark 50 years since their landmark RSC Macbeth. the production that first bound them together as artists and as friends. When the reporter suggested filming her up close, she answered without hesitation, "No, you don't, because I can't see anymore." McKellen, 86 himself, joked that they could still see her just fine. She laughed back. "Yes, and I can see your outline, and I know you so well in your Macbeth scarf." Then, almost gently, she said the part that mattered most. "I can't recognize anybody now, and people think, oh, get her, she's got very grand. But it's because I can't see. I can't see the television, and I can't see to read." 2 months earlier, on Trin Woodall's podcast Fearless, she had revealed something even more private. She no longer leaves her own home alone. "Somebody will always be with me," she said. "I have to now, because I can't see, and I will walk into something or fall over." True to form, she softened it with the dry humor that has carried her through every interview about this disease. "Fortunately, I don't have to now, because I pretend to have no eyesight." And yet, asked directly whether any of this made her want to retire, Judi Dench gave the answer that defines her more than any award ever could. "I don't want to retire," she said. "I'm not doing anything much at the moment because I can't see." She called the condition ghastly. She admitted that being so dependent on other people is terrible. But she did not say the word retirement. She has never said it. Not once. These days, that refusal has found a new direction. Judi Dench and Ian McKellen are campaigning together to revitalize the teaching of Shakespeare in schools across the United Kingdom, returning in spirit to the same partnership that began with Macbeth in 1976. She still appears at public events, always with someone beside her, still sharp, still funny, still unmistakably herself. In 2023, she spoke out in defense of the royal family, criticizing the crown for what she called crude sensationalism. She lives now in Surrey, not far from her daughter Finty and her grandson Sam. Her husband, Michael Williams, has been gone since 2001, and she has spent every year since carrying his absence the way she carries everything else, privately and without complaint. A woman who once held the world's attention through her eyes alone can no longer use them for the one thing they were trained to do. And still, she has not stopped working towards something. She has simply pointed it somewhere new. So what do you think? Is refusing to say the word retirement an act of denial, or one of the bravest things a person can do at 91? Tell us in the comments below. And if stories like this one move you the way they moved us, subscribe so you never miss the next one.